In my previous video, I demonstrated how I created a digital copy of my wooden shoemaking last, and today I'm going to walk you through how I used that 3D model to design my first 3D printable shoe parts. So once again, I'm hopping into Blender, and I'm going to head straight into an existing file where I have the 3D scan of my last. I obviously don't want to overwrite the work I've already done, so I'm going to save this as a new file with a descriptive name before carrying on. Next, I will duplicate the object in place a few times. The first dupe I'm going to rename to Top Profile, and the second one will become the Bottom Profile. And finally, I've got one that I'll call Outline. And then I'll hide all of the objects except for the outline for now. So now I'm looking at what's going to become the outline. This will be the shape of the top-down view of the sole, and for this one I'm going for a pretty classic, not super sporty design. So I want it to match this sharp feather edge on the last, rather than cupping up over the side of the shoe. One of the reasons I went to all the trouble to retopologize my 3D scan in the last video is because it makes steps like this, where I want to find certain landmarks on the last, a lot easier if I have really clean and well-organized geometry. So here I can just Alt-click to select the edge loop, and I have a nice continuous line that corresponds to that feather edge. That edge loop is the part I want to keep, so I'll invert the selection and delete everything else. Now I just have a clean outline to work with, but I actually want this to be nice and flat and two-dimensional. So I'll double check that I have my transform origin set to median point, and then I'll select everything and hit S, then Z, then 0 to align all of the vertices to the same Z height. Once I have it flat like this, I can fill in the outline with a single face, and then I'll extrude everything straight down a fairly generous distance, so I have a big chunky object that's flat on the top and bottom, but shaped like the outline all around, so it's like a super thick flip-flop. So I'll go ahead now and hide the outline object and take a look at the top profile object. Here I'm going to do basically the same thing, where I select the feather line edge loop and then invert my selection and delete the rest of the vertices. But instead of flattening the shape to 0 on the Z axis like I did for the outline, this time I want to zero everything out on the X axis, so I get a 2D side view instead. I don't need the full loop for that, so I'm just going to select one half of the shape, making sure that I start and end that selection at the very front and back tips of the last. I'll delete everything else. And then I hit S, X, and 0 to flatten them. So now I have a curve that's got way more vertices in it than I really need, so I'll use the limited dissolve option from the delete menu to simplify it a little bit. And I can also run a merge by distance if necessary. I'm going to take a similar approach with the bottom profile object, but instead of capturing the feather edge this time, I want to grab a curve that traces out that deepest curve of the sole. I'm going to be using this mainly as a reference for the very bottom shape of the sole that's going to be touching the ground. So rather than trying to match a shape of the last exactly, I do have a little bit of artistic license here. I could come along and trace this out by eye, but since I've got this mesh already here, I'm just going to command select a series of edges running roughly down the center, invert my selection, and delete everything else. Then, just like I did with the top profile, I'll scale everything to 0 on the x-axis and use limited dissolve to remove some of those excess vertices. From here, I get to make a few stylistic decisions, like how thick I want the sole to be, if I want it to be flat along the heel area, or have a little bit of a shaped cutout. Since this is my first attempt at this, I decided to keep it really simple and stick to a pretty basic slight wedge shape with just a completely flat bottom. Except I do want to maintain this little bit of toe spring curve at the front, and that's just so I don't trip over my own feet. But I'm going to grab all the rest of these vertices toward the back and line them up at their lowest point. So to do this, I'm using the same 0 scale on the Z-axis trick, except instead of using the median point or the global origin, I'm going to set the transform origin to active element, and then make sure the vertex I want to align to is the last one that I add to my selection, and it should show up in white. Then I hit S, Z, and 0, and they should all flatten out to that lowest point. I'm also going to select the whole shape and move it down 3 millimeters along the Z axis. The final sole is actually going to end up being a little bit thicker around the edges, but because I'm basing this curve on the lowest, deepest point of the last, I know that I'll have at least 3 millimeters of thickness, even at the thinnest points. Now I need to connect the top and bottom profiles. So first I'm going to hop over to Object Mode, select both those shapes, and duplicate them. I like to make a duplicate before I do anything drastic or destructive, so that if I get stuck or if something goes wrong later or I change my mind, I have a reliable save point to jump back to. And then I'll take my copies of the two profile shapes and join them into one object and rename it Full Profile. When I go back to edit mode now, I have both curves to work with in the same object, but they're not connected. I'm going to select the endmost vertices and hit F to connect those, and then I'll do the same at the other end. And once I have this continuous loop, I can hit F again to fill in a face. Now I want to extrude this face into a solid object, and I want to make sure it's wide enough to cover the outline shape I made earlier. So I'm going to make that outline visible again and switch to an overhead view. And then I can slide my profile face all the way to the left of the outline on the x-axis, then extrude straight across to the right of the outline, making sure to cover the whole thing generously. Next, I'm going to combine the outline and the profile using a Boolean intersection, which will leave me with just the parts where the two shapes overlap. But again, because this is a potentially destructive step, I'm going to make a duplicate so that I have a safe checkpoint to return to if I need it. I only need to duplicate one of these shapes. I'm going to use the profile here and rename it to Sole. And that's going to be the one that gets modified, while the outline is just going to act a bit like a cookie cutter. I also need to remember to take a couple more quick precautionary steps before I run the modifier. I have to make sure that I've applied any transformations on both the cutter and the target object. So if I've done any translations or rotations or scale operations, those need to be applied first. And I'm also going to double check that both these meshes are manifolds and have all of their faces pointing the right way out. Sometimes I do need to manually flip the normals around after doing these extrusions. Then with my new sole object selected, I set up the Boolean modifier to intersect mode and set the object to outline and hit apply. Okay, so now I've got this basic little wedge sole shape, but it's pretty flat across the top, and that's not going to fit my last very well at all. The next step is to do another Boolean operation, but this time we're going to take the difference of the sole and the last, which will scoop out that nice 3D curve that I'm trying to fit. The process here is really similar to the previous Boolean. I again want to duplicate this sole object I'm going to be modifying, and I'm going to double check that it's still lined up with the last. I'm also going to make sure I haven't missed any transformations that need to be applied, and I'm going to confirm that my mesh didn't pick up any weird problems from the last Boolean that might need repairing. And then I can add my modifier, set it to difference this time, and pick my last as the cutter object. I've decided to model and print the tread as a separate piece for a couple of reasons. First, I hope I'll be able to get a cleaner print on the tread details if I can print them flat and avoid having to remove any support material from the toe overhang. And second, having them separate will make it easier to have two different levels of infill density. I want the surface that's in direct contact with the ground to be really solid, so hopefully it will hold up to the wear and tear a little bit better, while I want the midsole to have a good amount of flex and squish, so I'm going to use a little bit less infill there. This approach does have the downside, though, that I'll have to bond these two fairly large face surfaces together, and to be honest, I am not at this point 100% confident that this is the best way to go, but I guess there is only one way to find out. So when I was first experimenting with how I wanted to do this step, I looked at the shape of the profile and I thought, oh, it's got this curve, this angle. I'm going to have to find some way to sort of peel off or unwrap that surface so that I make sure that I don't distort the dimensions when I flatten it out, because it's probably going to need to be a little bit longer than the original outline to account for that curvature, right? And I came up with this whole complicated, hacky workaround where I used an add-on called Export Paper Model, to make a PDF of like basically a flat pattern to build the shape out of paper. And there was this whole lot of messing around with settings and failed exports and opening the PDF in Illustrator
and turning the shape into an SVG and importing that shape back into Blender, and
after all that, it was the same dimensions as my original outline. I actually think this add-on is really cool, and I will probably play around with it some more in the future. I first heard about it from Kamui Cosplay, and I'll drop a link to that video in the description in case you want to learn more about it in the meantime. Anyway, after this exciting voyage of discovery, here I am with my outline shape, and I'm going to fill in a simple face to get started. I don't think I'm going to do anything too complicated with the tread pattern, but I do want to add a little bit of interest and hopefully some traction. So right now it's just a face with no thickness. So let's try, instead of extruding this time, let's try solidifying this face. I'm going to make it nice and thin since I'll be adding this to the rest of the thickness of the sole, and I'm also going to make that tread pattern that will add like a little bit of extra dimension to it as well. I played around with a lot of different ideas for extruding a tread design, and I think if I were going to do something like really aesthetic and fancy or kind of a more organic curved design, I would approach this really differently, and I would probably create that design in Illustrator and then come back and extrude it. But at this stage, I'm really trying to stay focused on a minimum viable prototype thing here, just to see if I'm on the right track, and so I'm going to make a nice simple geometric checkerboard type pattern. To create the underlying geometry, I'm adding a remesh modifier, and I'm setting it to sharp and an octree depth of 6. This gives me a nice even grid, and this kind of makes me regret not exploring this modifier more when I was retopologizing my last model, but I'll file that away for next time. After applying that modifier, I'm selecting alternating faces by holding down the Shift key as I click until I get a pattern that, I can live with, and then I will switch to the side view and extrude those faces by 1 millimeter, so I have just a very subtle tread. Before I export my models, I'm going to do a quick check with the 3D Print Toolbox add-on to make sure I didn't miss any issues with the geometry that might cause the print to fail. The only thing that's coming up is overhanging faces, which is expected and something I will deal with by either adding supports or laying parts flat, so I'm not going to worry about that for now. I'm also going to do one last look to make sure all of my transformations have been applied. Once everything looks ready to go, I'll select the first object I want to export and select Export as STL to get a 3D printable model. In the dialog box, I'm making sure that it's only exporting the selected object, and I'll give it a new name so I know which piece it is. So now I finally have models for soles that, in theory, should fit the curves of my wooden last perfectly. But obviously the story isn't over yet. I still need to actually get them printed, and what then? Will they be comfortable? Will they hold up to the wear and tear of city sidewalks? Will I even be able to get glue to stick to them? If you made it this far, I bet you don't want to miss the resolutions to these cliffhangers, so go ahead and hit the subscribe button to make sure you see when my future episodes pop up. Until then, stay curious.